Hi, everyone. I'm here with Mindy Martell, who is the president of Clothier Design Source and Apparel production team in St. Paul, Minnesota. Mindy and I are going to be talking about the ins and outs of production today, how to manufacture an apparel product in the US, and some of the challenges that new designers face. So Mindy, thank you so much for taking the time for us today.
Yeah, thank you, Shannon.
First, can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure. I'm the owner of a company called Clothier Design Source, and we've been around for about 10 years. And what we do is help brands develop their product, and we do that with all of the steps of pattern making and sample making. And then under our same roof, we have a factory. And so we will produce in small quantities in the USA for many brands.
I want to start out with one of the things that we've talked about before, and I think is one of the most valuable things for new designers to hear. And that's the mistakes that you can often make when you're first starting out. So can you walk us through some of the mistakes you see sort of when a new designer comes to you, they're really excited to go into production, but they haven't done X, Y, Z?
Sure. I would say the number one mistake that I see people make is to not approve samples before they go into production. So that means, I recommend getting an absolute perfect sample before you place a purchase order and before you say go to your manufacturing company. Because if you don't get it approved, you never can tell what was misinterpreted. So that, to me, that's the number one issue. The second issue I see quite often is people purchasing bulk fabric before it's really been proven or tested that fabric is going to work. So I would hold off, even though you're very excited to get started, holding off on purchasing your bulk fabric, I highly recommend.
Yeah, that's a huge one. And just the money investment that goes into buying all this fabric, and then you don't know if you're not going to need it or if it's just not the right fabric for the product. That's a big one.
Yep, exactly.
Yes. Mm-hmm. So as we're sort of talking about the pre-production, we'll get into production, but pre-production, can you give us a list of some of the things that you need to have ready to go before you can hit go on production?
Sure. So we've developed a checklist, which is on our website. It's called the manufacturing checklist. And on that checklist, I believe we have 13 points, which include an approved sample, which I mentioned earlier. You must have all of your bulk fabric, all of your bulk trims. Your labels must be finalized. Having a tech pack. Creating a purchase order, having funding, of course. Those are 7 that come to the top of my mind right now, but those are the 7 big ones for sure.
Yeah, it's funny. I also have a manufacturing checklist on the Factory45 site. Okay. So I'm sure anyone who's watching can go to both websites and get those. And I'm sure there's some overlap, but maybe some new ones too. I want to talk a little bit about the more detailed steps. Like, for example, grading. That's something that is a little bit foreign to people who aren't in the industry. Like, what is it? How does it work? Can you talk to us about that?
Sure. So grading is the act of changing a pattern into different sizes. So when we go through the development process, we start with one size, usually a base size of medium or large. And then once that pattern gets perfected and it fits perfect, then we do grading, which is turning that pattern into all the different sizes you're going to offer. And it's a really interesting process because you can't just use a percentage to make the pattern bigger, because the way the human body grows is it grows different in your neck, it grows different in your chest, it grows different in your waist. So all of those different all the different areas that the pattern are going to grow are based off of data over the entire population of the world and how they grow.
And so then at what point in pre-production does the grading process happen?
We do it after the sample has been approved and is totally perfected in the base size. It is one of the very last steps that happen before production.
Before production.
Yeah.
Another detail I think that is often overlooked is labels. And what I tell my Factory45 entrepreneurs is everything needs to be at the factory, the sew shop, the cut and sew, whatever you're using, before you can start production. You need everything there. Labels is one of those things that's often forgotten about. Can you talk to us about sort of what everyone should know about ordering labels?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I can't tell you how many times I've seen labels delay a production run or a launch. They're just this little tiny thing that seems like such a quick afterthought. Many new designers get that product completely perfected, ready to go, and then you can't really move into production until you have that label. The pattern might have to change because of the way the label is going to be placed. Things need to be tested if it's a heat transfer label. It's a whole development process unto itself. And so I highly recommend getting started as soon as you get started with your product development. I recommend getting started with the label development at the same time.
Right, because there's an individual design process for the label too, sort of like a graphic design process.
Exactly. And I still think you need to go through the sampling process.
Yes.
With the labels as well.
Yes. Let's talk about production cutting methods, yield, colorways. Like, what does all that stuff mean to someone who isn't in the industry, and what does it all involve?
Sure. So I like to explain what production cutting is to people, and get them to imagine what the cut looks like, because I think it explains a lot. So if you can imagine, if you were ordering, 100 smalls, 100 mediums, and 100 larges, and then you took 100 layers of fabric, and you stacked them up on top of each other, and then you put one small pattern, one medium pattern, and one large pattern on top of that stack, and that's what you cut, you would end up with the quantities, the 300 pieces I mentioned earlier. So I think that's a good visual for new people into the industry, because I'm not sure how they probably haven't thought about how we're cutting it, but it's a good visual. And then what happens when you start mixing your ratio of sizes, so nobody ever needs exactly 100 100 100, right? So you start mixing your ratio of sizes, 100, 50, 25 of this, 30 of that, and then you imagine different amounts layered underneath them. It starts messing with your yield. So your yield is not a static thing. Your yield is constantly changing. If you're ordering a bunch of extra larges, you're going to have a much higher yield. If you're ordering a bunch of extra smalls, you're going to have a much lower yield. And as those quantities fluctuate, your yield is going to fluctuate well. Does that make sense?
Yes, so your yield is essentially coming out of the fabric. That's what you're sort of basing it on, is how much a yard of fabric is going to give you.
Correct, yes. Yes, to start way back at the beginning, yes.
Yes, yeah. Sometimes you have to get to like the basics
sure.
to start, but yes. And then in terms of colorways, what does that look like for production?
You have to stick to the fabrics that are used, no matter what colors you're switching to. So if you're using an interlock on the body and a mesh on the sleeve, then you have to remain with the interlock on the body and mesh on the sleeves, but you can change the colors. So if you have a red/blue shirt, red interlock, blue sleeves, then that's one colorway, red/blue. Then if you're changing the colorway to pink/purple, pink body, purple sleeves, then that's another colorway, which would be pink/purple.
I think one of the questions actually that a lot of people have is like, does it change your pricing? And for some, in some scenarios, it does change it. In others, it doesn't. Can you tell us what that looks like?
I think a lot of it depends on the factory's policies. Yep. So for instance, our factory here, we charge a thread color change fee. It's a minimal fee of, I think, just $35 or something like that to switch our machines, switch the different colors of thread that we have in our machines to switch the colorway. Our factory does not include it in the minimum, so we have a minimum order of 100 pieces right now, and you can mix colorways in there. It's fine. You would just have to pay that colorway change thread fee. But again, that's definitely something you want to ask the factory that you're going to work with. Everyone has different policies on how that works into their minimum. Some people have minimums by colorway.
Yes, it's a huge discrepancy. And I think that's why asking as many questions up front of your production partner before you start this, because a lot of times I think production can start and then it's not that hidden costs come up, but you just didn't think to ask your production partner about those other things that could entail additional cost.
Correct. Yep. Yep.
So let's talk about once production starts. What should a new designer expect?
I think a new designer should stay involved. They should probably expect weekly to bi-weekly updates from the manufacturer. I really recommend scheduling a visit to the factory, and when they're in the heart of production. I think it's great to just come and see the process. You get a better understanding of it, and you might also catch something that maybe wasn't talked about beforehand, or maybe they're missing. But scheduling a visit is great. You should expect, I've talked about this before, but approved samples. And a TOP sample is good, which is called top of production. And so when production gets started and everything moves from a sample room to the production room, you can expect another sample, so you can sign off and say, yep, this is right.
And I think this is something that surprises new designers a lot, is like, oh my gosh, I need another sample? Like, how many samples can I possibly need? Yeah. That's something that, and there's cost involved, and so that can be surprising, but it's just so important to the final outcome of the product to go through that sampling as much as, now, we're on about like sample 3, if your first sample was perfect in the beginning.
It could be your 4th or 5th sample.
In most cases, exactly, yeah.
In most cases. And like I've mentioned this already several times in this interview, but it is my mantra: sample, sample, sample. Because if it costs, whatever it costs for that sample, that TOP sample, you can, if you can imagine your whole bulk production coming in wrong and how much that costs, and you compare it to that one sample cost, it is completely worth it. It's completely worth it.
It will save you so much in the long run.
Right, right. Definitely.
I'll add to that, I think some of it in the sample making process, there's also the issue of testing that I think is often overlooked. Like, does this snap fit in this fabric? Is it going to pull? Is it going to come out? Does this button, work with this knit? That type of thing is so important as well. And that's why you have so many samples, is you don't want to produce, 500 units and find out that none of the snaps work in the fabric.
Exactly. Yep. So any little tiny change, even if it's adding an embroidery or, like you said, adding a button or something like that, any tiny change I think should be sampled.
So on the same note, sampling can really impact quality, but what are other ways that a designer can, ensure that the quality is up to par, quality control?
I think making a tech packet or having a tech packet made, also known as specification sheets, technical design packets. In the industry, there's lots of names for them, but it's really a series of documents that list out construction methods, stitches per inch, types of stitch to join different areas. It lists out measurements. We call them POMs, or points of measure, in different areas of the piece. And the really important thing that many people ignore in the beginning are tolerances. So, those points of measure, let's say the chest is supposed to be 30 inches around. You might want to set a tolerance of an inch or a half inch, depending on what you're producing. And that manufacturer has to agree to that tolerance, because if they could be taking too big of seam allowance, they could be shorting you when they're cutting it to save on fabric. There's all sorts of things that can happen, but that tech pack is a really good quality control tool of your expectations and your tolerances that you're willing to accept.
Do you have a person who is just on quality control management, or is that sort of something that happens throughout the entire process?
In the production department, we have a quality control manager, and then there's a whole department under her. In the development department is where we create the tech packs and create what the standards are and the tolerances. And then we meet with our quality control department and make sure everyone thinks those are feasible, reasonable, and then we present it to our clients. That's how we work. But I could see, going with other factories, or like I said, every factory is different with their policies. You might not even have a tech pack. You might just go into production, which I don't recommend. I think establishing what you're expecting and getting those tolerances on board and having both parties agree to them make a lot of sense.
Because then there's no surprises. Nobody has to, everyone's on the same page. That's so important between the production partner and the designer.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I think another thing that can possibly be on people's mind is what goes on behind the scenes in production. One of the things that we've talked about and I highly recommend is visiting your factory when you're in production. But sort of, when someone emails you and is saying, how's production going? They're checking up, and maybe they don't get a response for a few days and they're, freaking out. Like, what's going on behind the scenes?
Sure. So there's a lot of moving parts. There's several steps and several departments, or sub-departments, I should say, that are touching the product. There's the marker maker. That's one of the first things that happens. So they're making an efficient yield, kind of like we talked about earlier, putting all those pieces of the puzzle together to lay up the layered cut. So that's one area that it's in. Then it moves into cutting. And then from cutting, there's some prep work that needs to get done. You might have a snap or a grommet or a heat transfer label or something that has to happen before it goes into sewing. And then when it's in sewing, one thing a lot of new people don't understand is if you have 1,000 pieces in sewing, you're not finishing 50 and then 50 and then 50 and then 50. You are doing assembly line construction, really. So you might sew all 1,000 sleeves first, and then you might sew all 1,000 side seams second, and you might sew all 1,000 collars third. And so you've got these partial garments that are all not going to be finished until at the very end, when they all get their hem on the bottom. So there, so that's going on too. So there's all these moving parts of maybe snaps or grommets or embroideries or silk screens and all those things that need to happen. And then there also is the sewing that of course is, happening in segments and finishing at the very, very end.
Right. A lot of moving parts, like you said. Yes. I want to ask you, if there's one thing that you want someone to take away from this interview, what is it? What do you want them to remember?
I want them to remember to get an approved sample. All of the other things that we talked about, tech packs are great. They add to the quality and add to everything. But if a brand is going to change anything at all, the fabric, the thread, the buttons, whatever, I definitely want them to sample again and get it approved.
Yes, because that will cut down on so many headaches later on in the process. If you do that right the first time. It's almost like the product development piece, I think, should even be one of the take the longest amount of time in most cases.
Yep, exactly.
Mindy, thank you so much for your time today. It's been awesome.
Thank you, Shannon. It's been great.